Hi, folks, and I had a request, suggestion, whatever you want to call it, about talking about recovery after the long run. And the first thing I thought about is, wow, that's a really, really hard topic because there's a lot of things to consider with that, and there's not really any one answer. So I'll give you some of the things that I think about, but you kind of have to figure it out as you go because it's very individualized, as you will see. So, first of all, what in the world is a long run? Well, a long run is really any run of 90 or more minutes. There are certain physiological things that happen at 90 minutes, so to really be considered a long run, it needs to be 90 minutes or more. But the next thing you have to look at is, well, how long was your long run? Was it 90 minutes? Was it 120 minutes? But I see my old typing shows through. Is it 160 minutes? So how long was that? Because a 90-minute run and a 160-minute run are probably going to be really different. The next thing is, was this the first time you've ever done this distance? Is it the 50th time you've ever done that distance? That's going to make a difference with what you're going to do too. The preceding week, what were you doing leading up to that long run? That has an implication with what you're going to do. The percentage of the weekly miles has an implication. Generally speaking, what I have found is that the higher the percentage of your weekly miles exist in that one run, the more draining it is for you. So for the sake of example, if your week is normally, say, 40 miles and you do a 20-mile run, that's one thing. But if it's a 30-mile week and 20 miles are in one run, you're going to tend to find that more draining. That's my experience. The actual guideline is you don't want your long run to be much more than 25 to 30% of your weekly miles. That's really hard for most people to do unless they get the miles in during the week, but that percentage of weekly miles does tend to matter. So what are some things that you should do for recovery? So the first thing is don't do nothing. There's a lot of people say, I want a rest day after the long run. I would recommend not taking a rest day. Now, that doesn't mean you have to run. You might go out and go for a brisk walk for an hour. You might rollerblade. You might do the elliptical, the bike. You might run. It really depends. But if at all possible, I don't recommend you do nothing. Now, if something is sore, hurts, obviously you shouldn't. But other than that, in order to aid recovery, we're talking about getting oxygen and fuel and blood flow to your muscles. Well, activity does that. So the one thing I think is pretty much universal is, when possible, don't do nothing after your long run. You want to do a little bit something. So other things to do, I will talk first of all immediately after your long run. So immediately after your long run, you should be refueling within about 60 minutes at a 4-to-1 ratio, meaning 4 parts carbohydrate, 1 part protein. Protein is to help the muscles repair because protein is the building blocks of your muscles. The carbohydrates are to start replenishing your glycogen stores because you've used a lot of glycogen, your muscle fuel, when you've been doing that run. So within 60 minutes, you want to get in some calories, 4-to-1 ratio. I recommend ice baths. Now, I'll be honest, I personally hate ice baths, but I have to take, but ice baths are really great. Why? You've generally, on a really long run, probably done some degree of muscular damage in there. That's just part of what goes on. So that ice bath is going to go a long ways towards easing any inflammation, make it feel any better. And then the final thing is just refueling in general throughout the day, making sure you eat enough. A very common thing that happens is people will be on a long run, they burn 1,500 calories. I think, oh, this is great for my weight loss program because I'm not going to replace those. I'm going to use that deficit so I can lose some weight. And they're fine that day because a lot of times people aren't hungry the day of their long run. And then the next day or the day after that, they clean out the refrigerator because they're starving. So I don't recommend that you use the long run as this big calorie deficit day. You got to get some calories in during the day, even if it means drinking those calories because your body's going to come back after those. So other things to consider, think next week, not tomorrow. So recovery is not necessarily a next day thing. Again, it might be. Were you running for 160 minutes versus 90 minutes? Is it your 50th time versus your first time? Those things come into consideration. But you often have to think of the entire week and what things are going to look like. So let me give you an example of my first marathon that I ran. I had, about 5 years I hadn't done a marathon at all, and I was getting ready to run a marathon. And I was kind of curious. I looked back over some of my runs. I made the comment to my coach that I had, I think, 1 run of 18 miles, 2 run of 16 miles in the last 5 years, and everything else was less than that. He says, well, we might as well get going with the long runs. And all of a sudden I find out I've got a 20-mile long run on a Saturday and then a 10-mile run the next day at marathon pace. I thought, he must have misunderstood what I said because that can't possibly be right. So I checked him. I said, you didn't understand. I said, I've run like over 15 miles 3 times in the last 5 years. He says, yeah, that's fine. He says, you've got this. It's built into the total plan of what you're doing, meaning he was considering that 20 and 10 coming up in the week, and he was considering it a little bit the week after. He also knew that I had done 20 milers many, many times before. It just hadn't been for 5 years. And it ended up, I'll tell you what, after the 10 miles at marathon pace the next day, Mark was a tired boy, but I really didn't have any problem accomplishing those workouts because the entire thing had been pieced together. It was what I did the week before and what I was doing the week after that came into play. So as I said at the beginning, there isn't a one answer, but those are all things that you have to think about when you kind of figure out what is the recovery that you might need after the long run beyond the things I said about getting refueled, the 4-to-1 ratio, ice baths, and things like that, because I think those should be a standard. But if you're really not sure to do, a really good rule is, when in doubt, do less.